A death for a loved one can be a defining point in many people's lives, for better or for worse. Death is something everyone must go through at some point in their lives. According to Howarth, there are some underlying assumptions of grief stage theories, and success is measurable within each one. The first grief stage theory I'll be discussing is by John Babley, Attachment and Loss. Babley believed the stages of grief were 1. Numbness, 2. Urge to recover the lost object followed by disorganization, and 3. Adaptive reorganization. Babley is saying that the first thing a person feels after death is numbness, meaning that they can't feel much of anything and are emotionally shut off. Then, as they come out of this stage, they have an intense need to fill the hole in their heart that was left from the death. This frantic action takes up so much of one's time and personal matter that their life becomes cluttered and disorganized, one might say falling apart. The success of these stages is for one's adaptive functions as a human to kick in and reorganize their life. The second grief stage theory is by William Worden, Grief Counseling and Grief Therapy. He believed the stages were first to accept the reality of the loss, then to experience and process the pain, followed by adjusting to an environment where the deceased is missing, and finally, withdraw emotional energy from the deceased and to reinvest. This one's success is more personal, as it primarily relies on one's healing time and ability to adjust. Accepting the reality and to experience and process the pain are two very large steps within the process, he explains. And to finally reinvest one's energy into other things besides the deceased is a very moving sentiment, and one that could help a lot of people with their grieving process. The third grief stage theory is by Therese Randall, The Treatment of Complicated Mourning. They believe the stages were to recognize the loss, react to the separation, recollect and re-experience deceased and the relationship, and relinquish old attachments of the old assumptive world, readjust to move adaptively to new world without forgetting, and finally to reinvest. This is the longest of given stage theories, and one that is very patient. It allows for the person to savor and remember all the memories left behind by the deceased and figure out how to hold on to them without having to completely forget. I would say I primarily agree with the last two stage theories. They are much more slow and have enough room for the person who's in the grieving process to not feel rushed, nor take too slow to the point that it takes a large chunk out of their years alive. Dealing with death is something that should be taken slowly. These theories also put a lot of faith in the person to hold on to memories of the deceased while also investing themselves into other things that could make a positive impact on them. This sort of energy, if you will, is something I believe is really good when speaking about death, as someone should be inspired to live their life with even more meaning, as that's what their loved ones would have wanted for them. After learning about medicalization, it's a term that is very broad, so there are a lot of things that can fit into its definition. Medicalization is defined as the process by which human conditions and problems come to be defined and treated as medical conditions, and thus become the subject of medical study, diagnosis, prevention, or treatment. Howarth defines it as a concept used by sociologists to refer to the process by which social life comes to be seen through the lens of medicine. Although all these grief stage theories have more medicalized terms within the realms of psychology and sociology, it's still talking about the health of an individual, more of their emotional health, if you will. They're breaking down the stages of grief and giving insight on how one can deal with such strong emotions in more healthy ways to improve someone's well-being. Looking at medicalization in this light, I find it very intriguing as social aspects of life also play a huge role in someone's personal health. If these grief stages can be broken down even more and applied more personally to a range of people experiencing grief, it would have a huge positive impact on many who have a harder time dealing with such emotions. Howarth begins talking about how once grief and loss were thought of as primarily psychological adjustments, but after some studies, it proved to be more of a social focus. Howarth states, in order to understand bereavement better, we need to reject the idea that grief is universally experienced and focus instead on the social construction of loss and all of its cultural diversity. Howarth puts emphasis on how big of a role culture plays within the grief process, and without taking it into account, people from other cultures can witness another culture's process of grief, and it could seem outlandish. She refers to a study conducted by N. Small, in which he studies the history of grief and bereavement during the 21st century. He takes the physical, spiritual, and intellectual aspects of grief and applies that to other cultures, as other cultures may have very different beliefs concerning the three aspects. When looking at grief through this lens, it's easier to understand how different cultures may deal with the loss and grief much differently than others. Howarth explains that with this information, loss and grief are indeed social constructs, as it's important for cultural norms to be understood in the context of personal styles and social experiences and expectations when on the topic of loss and grief. This one is a little more difficult for me, as most of the death I've experienced happened at a much earlier age, where I wasn't able to process a lot of it. I think back to the death of my grandparents on my father's side. My grandmother was the first to pass, and I was 11 at the time. This death was the most impactful on me as it was the first person I was very close to that I lost. My grandmother was my best friend for a number of years as she was the one who took care of me while my parents were at work. She was Catholic, so she had a traditional Catholic funeral with an open casket and a viewing time before the actual ceremony. I remember vividly looking upon my grandmother and thinking they had swapped her out with some dummy because of how different she looked. I feel like this is a terrible ceremony and waiting to see a loved one. You want the last time looking at them to be when they're still full of life and able to share that memory. The fact that both Catholic and Christian funerals are for mourning is something else I never truly understood. Funerals should be a celebration of the life that this person lived, looking back at all of their accomplishments and the impact that they made on the ones around them. Life is something that only happens once. We shouldn't see the end of it as some sort of loss or sad time, instead showcasing all the beauties that came with one's life and showing how important it was to those attending such a ceremony. I also wanted to make it clear that I don't mean you're not allowed to feel sad after a loved one's death. This is a major event, and sadness or grief is a normal human reaction to such things. But the idea of a funeral to mourn and only be reminded more and more that this person is gone adds more emphasis to the actual death, making it hard to look back at all of the wonderful moments that were recreated from that person.